press the record button. Enough. And let everyone in. There we go.
If you don't know the count of 75 pound, what I do, that's probably.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Islamic Courses Zoom session titled Book Review Discussion, India in the Persianate Age, 1000 to 1765. Honored and very privileged to have the author, Professor Richard Eaton from the University of Arizona, US of A, and it's hosted by my dear friend, starred Professor Jonathan Brown from Georgetown University, as well from the US of A. Just a quick reminder before I hand it over to Professor Jonathan, who's going to introduce the speaker and the subject. Please keep your phones or devices on mute. It is being recorded, so if you're not already on our mailing list or registered, please leave your email on the chat and we'll send you a link once it's uploaded. And there is a Q&A session. So what's going to happen, Dr. Jonathan is going to be engaging and talking with the professor and Professor Richard Eaton for the next 40 minutes or so. And after that, we'll have around another half an hour for Q&A with the public. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Jonathan. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Well, assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is a real treat for me, so I'm not going to waste any time. This bio is, it's like saying Madonna is a musician or something. This is a short bio. It really should be a lot longer. Richard Eaton is a professor of history at the University of Arizona. I'm reading from the bio from the sleeve of his book. And the author of several groundbreaking books on India before 1800, including the classic The Rise of Islam on the Bengal Frontier. So I'll just say that Professor Eaton is known for, he's published so much, so many books, so many articles. He really, maybe the leading scholar of kind of India in the Persianate age, Islam in the Islamic age and the Muslim age, however one wants to call it. There's just a couple, these are the books of his that I have, right? So one is this Essays on Islam and Indian History, which is a collection of his articles and I think book chapters from other earlier books. This is an edited collection that he edited, India's Islamic Traditions, which is a fantastic resource. I've used this actually a lot. There's a lot of really valuable material in here. But his most famous book, I think, is The Rise of Islam on the Bengal Frontier. And this book is the one we're going to be discussing today. And, I got to say, it's ironic. I actually don't like reading very much. Which is kind of weird being a professor, but I don't very rarely read books cover to cover. And this book I read cover to cover and I actually enjoyed it. I don't know if you've all read it, but I really recommend it. It is a very easy read. It's beautifully written. It is detailed without being tiresome. It's comprehensive without being overwhelming. It's theoretically sophisticated without being kind of arcane and overly academic. It covers almost every aspect of kind of life, whether it's politics, economics, society, religion, art, architecture, talking about Indian history, integrating it into global history, both in the kind of Indian Ocean world, in the world of Iran and Central Asia, by an author whose expertise and language abilities have made him able to access and master sort of all these different factors and dynamics. I really can't say enough good stuff about the book. I really, really highly recommend it. It's also got some great pictures in it for those of you who like pictures like me. So actually, before we were, you all joined, I was talking to Professor Eaton about his life experience, which I think is really interesting on its own. So maybe you can kind of review briefly what you were telling me about how you got interested in the study of Indian history and also kind of your journey through the different languages and the region itself.
Yes. Well, first of all, Jonathan, thank you for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to join you and to be back in touch with Islamic circles in London, because I have my own very fond memories of about 10 years ago when I had the good fortune of spending several days on the east side of London with you folks. But yes, to your question as to how I kind of got into the whole field, when I graduated from college, I got a telegram from Sergeant Shriver, and before I opened the telegram, I assumed that I had just been drafted into the Vietnam War, since his first name was Sergeant. But then when I opened up the telegram, it said that I had been chosen to join the first Peace Corps project to Iran, which was absolutely a no-brainer. For one thing, I had no other alternative after my graduating from college. I had no plan. So this fell into that. Secondly, my parents, my mother and father, were both already in Iran. My father was the doctor, the surgeon, the chief physician at the Christian hospital in Mashhad. Had been there already for 5 years. And my grandmother had been born in Iran, since my great-grandfather had come out there in the 19th century as a Presbyterian missionary in Urumia and Tabriz. And by pure luck or fate or something, the Peace Corps sent me back to the same city, Tabriz, about a century after my great-grandfather had lived there. So all of this was kind of destiny. And I spent 2 years in Iran, learned the language, came to love Iranian culture. And while I was there, I and 2 other Peace Corps volunteers made the fateful decision to visit India and Pakistan. So we hitchhiked. Well, we didn't hitchhike. At that point, we were taking trains and buses through Iran and down through Pakistan, and then through virtually all of India, or at least a lot of India, as far south as Madras and as far east as Calcutta. And then we came back to Afghanistan. At that point, I hitchhiked through Afghanistan, came back after a month of this traveling. And for me, this had a huge impact, because when I visited India, I saw all this evidence of Persian culture and Islamic culture, which I was not prepared for. Nobody told me that there were Muslims in India. I only subsequently learned that India, in fact, has a larger Muslim population than the entire Middle East. And so I see this architecture, I hear the music, I see the cuisine, the food, all this evidence of Iranian culture in India, and I was immediately hooked on it, and I wanted to understand more. You know, how did this come about? How do we understand the relationship between Persian and Indian cultures, between Sanskrit and Persian, between Hinduism and Islam? And how do we explain the differential influences and the different impacts that Iran and Persian and Islam had? Because it's not even throughout South Asia. You know, in some parts there's greater influence, in other parts there's less influence. How do we explain that? So this has kind of became my lifelong obsession, if you will. And that's how I began my work on working on Islam in South Asia. But this book that you're introducing today, Jack, really represents the culmination of an earlier fixation with Persian language and Persian culture, which I see as an alternative way of understanding Indian history. And maybe we could talk about that more later on. But basically, to give you a sense of my own background, that's how it began. I became interested largely I became interested in conversion to Islam to understand how do we explain the extraordinarily large populations and large Muslim communities and societies in South Asia. And my first book, The Sufis of Bijapur, was really an attempt to explain that. Why? Because when I announced that I wanted to understand conversion, everybody told me that, well, in that case, you have to study Sufis, because that's what Sufis do. So I said, okay, I'll study Sufis. So I went out and did this year-long research of the Sufis in one part of India, namely the Deccan Plateau, only to find that the Sufis were not remotely interested in converting anyone to Islam, completely overthrew all the assumptions that I had held. It completely refuted the one thing that perhaps both Indians and Pakistanis agree on, which is that Islam grew because of Sufism. And it's my sad news to report that that probably is not true. That the one thing they agree on is not the case. So I did a study of the social roles of Sufis to find out what they were doing. If they were not running around converting Hindus to Islam, what were they really doing? And that launched me into that kind of social study of Sufism. But I never left my original aim of understanding Islamization. That's the reason I went to study Bengal, because I decided that if I really want to take seriously this question of Islamization, then I have to go to Bengal, study Bangla language, and immerse myself in that culture to try to figure that out. So basically, that in a nutshell, Jack, is kind of how I got into this larger question.
Wow. So again, by the way, people, if you didn't hear me before, I really encourage you. Again, I do not read books cover to cover, almost never do that. I hate reading. I really enjoyed reading this book. I really enjoyed almost every page. So I cannot recommend it enough to you. So one of the things that I remember the Greek historian Polybius, 2nd century BC, writes History of Rome, and he says that like the three things historians need to do: they need to be able to praise their enemies and criticize their friends. They need to know sort of historical sources, and they said they need to know the actual places that the events occurred. And one of the things that I really liked about this book is you really seamlessly weave into the book your understanding of the landscape, the geography, the topography, and I think that's so. I think that's one, pretty rare, and two, extremely useful in general. I think probably more so than normal in study of Indian history. To explain why, what is it about the Deccan? There's I think Vindhya mountains. Those are these low hills, mountains. Like what is it that, when people said Hind in 1300, they didn't mean India, right? They meant essentially the kind of Gangetic plain. What is it about Gujarat? What is Gujarat as a what makes it a unit? Malabar, why is Malabar connected to the Indian Ocean and kind of not really connected to the actual Deccan as much? And so one thing I really wanted to hear maybe from your own experience is in your travels, whether it was those original travels or later research trips, do you remember any times when you kind of saw a place or a region, or you were driving or taking a train somewhere and you noticed something about the geography and the topography that kind of unlocked some understanding for you about a history that you had previously maybe had not been able to figure out?
Oh, I think yes, all the time. I mean, India, South Asia, the whole subcontinent is so extraordinarily diverse in terms of topography and climate zones that you cannot help but try to understand what is the connection between that and the historical record. So yes, I mean, I recall, for example, the first time that I descended into the Indus Valley. I came down through the Bolan Pass from Quetta on a train, and you're up on the plateau, the Iranian plateau, and we always hear about the Iranian plateau, but when you've been living on the Iranian plateau for a full year, as I had been, you take it for granted. But then suddenly, when you descend through the Bolan Pass down into the Indus Valley, you are in a completely new world. It's low, it's flat, it's green. And that's I connected that with, later on I read Babur, the Baburnama, when he is for the first time encountering India. Like me, he was coming from the Iranian plateau, descending through the Khyber Pass, and has the same reaction. That is to say, he found a world that to him was completely different. The domestic architecture was different, the crops were different, the wildlife was different. And so I guess to answer your question, to me, my initial encounter with South Asia, coming from Pakistan, I could even say that a train from Pakistan into South Asia, that was a defining moment. That when I really suddenly said, wow, this is a different place, totally different place. And that's only one such occasion I could cite like that.
One thing that, I guess is kind of a long time pet question of mine, and it may be a stupid question, so you can either get rid of it quickly or answer it if it's worth it, which is, and you bring this up at a few points in the book about especially with Shah Jahan, the way that the Mughals hang on to their kind of pastoral nomadic Central Asian kind of horseman past, not just in the kind of sense of Timur and his legacy of sovereignty, but really in the idea of, always having a falcon and this. What I was wondering is, did they kind of consciously preserve a sense of like a nomadic roving capital that was different from the Indian tradition, that was distinct from it?
Yes, they did. I mean, the capital of the Mughal Empire was wherever the emperor happened to be. And the emperor was, it's true, Akbar stayed in Lahore for something like 8 or 9 years. Shah Jahan spent most of his time in Agra until he built Shah Jahanabad. But so there were those capitals, obviously, which follows a very ancient tradition of Indian military statecraft. On the other hand, unlike Indian kings, classical Indian kings who stayed in their Rajdhani, their capital, the Mughals retained that kind of Central Asian tradition of mobility, of living in tents. And if you look at the architecture, even when they did settle down and build capital cities like Shah Jahanabad, you look at the Divan-e-Khas or any of these structures, they still retain something like a tent-like structure almost. You could see the tent pole and the architecture, the way it's built, has a distant echo of a yurt or something out of Central Asia. So there is this lingering memory of a Timurid past, which they never let go of. And you're quite right, Shah Jahan is the one who most explicitly reinforces that, not least by attempting to reconquer Badakhshan and northern Afghanistan in his rather misguided assumption that he was the second Lord of Conjunction after Timur himself. So yes, I would answer your question by saying that absolutely there is that memory, and the Mughals acted it out when they were traveling. Aurangzeb spent 25 years in the Deccan, living like a classic Central Asian Badshah, which is to say, living in tents and moving around with the army.
When you go to a place like the Agra or Shah Jahanabad, and you see, in the Divan-e-Khas, you see in the Divan-e-Khas like the Takht, right, which is this. It sort of looks like a marble platform or something.
Right.
Did they put their throne on top of that, the peacock throne or whatever they were sitting on, or did they just put a bunch of pillows there? Or what was that thing you're actually looking at now when you go and you see these places?
Yeah, if you go to that's right. If you go to Shah Jahanabad now in Old Delhi, in the Red Fort, what you're actually seeing, that marble canopy, which by the way has really traces its architectural roots to Bengal, with a curved cornice, you have there. That was not the throne. That simply held the peacock throne. The peacock throne itself, of course, was taken away by Nader Shah, 1739. There was another kind of a ersatz second throne put in there, but it was not the original peacock throne after Nader Shah left, after he raided North India. So yeah, the peacock throne itself was taken back, and I believe that it was ultimately broken up in Iran, although I've also heard that parts of it survive in the Banka-Meli in Tehran, and I'm not quite certain which is true, whether it still survives in part or whether it's totally broken up and into jewels. After all, it was nothing but jewels from end to end. Yeah.
Well, to get back to your interest in conversion, which really surprised me, was that in Bengal, and I think this is under Jahangir, you say he actually kind of punished people who promoted changing any religion, right? So that actually, like, the Mughals were discouraged conversion to Islam in Bengal, and actually seems like they didn't want anybody to change any religion. They just sort of wanted. Can you explain that? I mean, I think that's probably very surprising to anybody. Why? What was their reasoning?
Oh, I don't think it's surprising at all. The Mughals were an empire, and in an empire, you need to please everybody. You don't want to rock the boat. And if anyone is out there indulging and trying to change people's cultural identity, they are understandably seen as upsetting the kind of stability that the empire requires. In my view, the Mughals really stood for three things, which was revenue, loyalty, and stability. They did not care about religion. And in my analysis of the original sources in Bengal, just speaking of that part of the empire, they promoted the building of Hindu temples as much as they did the building of mosques. They didn't care, as long as there was some kind of structure there that would provide institutional stability on the frontier. That's what they wanted, the stability. So you're right. When the Mughals found that one of their officers had converted somebody to Islam, he was punished. He was taken. His Jagir assignment was reduced, and that's sending a very clear message that the Mughals were not about to tamper with religion.
Another thing you mentioned, which I was really surprised by in Bengal, is that it's really only in the, maybe I misunderstand this, it's really only in the 1500s that you start seeing the use of paper in Bengal. And then so like things like paper and pen, these words in Indian, non-Persian Indian languages are actually from Persian and Arabic, qalam and kaghiz. So how were things recorded or written in Bengal prior to that time?
Well, you had a number of things. You had these kind of paper-like reeds that were used to write on, and they would be these long, thin reeds would be bound together by a metal cylinder of some kind, or like a keychain. They were used, but much more awkward than paper itself. So when paper comes to Bengal or anywhere in India, it very rapidly replaces the existing technology of writing. And because it was so much more easy to use, it rapidly, it meant a number of things. For one thing, it enhanced state power because it meant that more orders could be sent out and received between capitals and peripheries. And it also meant that things like, the court, judicial decisions could reach further down into local society because of the advent of paper, meant that there was a larger bureaucracy, both for revenue bureaucracy and for justice. And so I see the technology of paper as being fundamental in understanding the diffusion of state power, but also ultimately new religious systems. Obviously, Islam is a religion of the book. Well, you're not going to have the book without paper. And so that also, I think, supported the diffusion of the Islamic tradition as well. And as you rightly point out, the word Kagaz, which is, I think, ultimately a Turkish word, or it comes from somewhere in Central Asia, into Persian, and kalam, the Arabic word for pen. These words are found all over South Asia, whether it's Telugu or Kannada or Bengali or Marathi or whatever it might be. Indeed, in the 17th century, it's estimated that 40%, as much as 40% of the vocabulary of Marathi was in fact Persian, which gives you some idea of the extraordinary influence of the whole Persian cultural tradition that kind of sweeps over South Asia. And that in turn is what really made me think about using the language as a central organizing feature of the book.
On the other, I mean, the kind, I guess the tension or the dynamic in the book is really this interaction between the sort of Persianate world, Persianate idiom, language, literature, culture, and then the sort of Sanskrit world. And so they kind of blend, they bleed into one another, they shape one another, they intermingle. One of the things I thought was really interesting is you talk about the kind of the sort of Indianization or the Sanskritization or the Rajputization of these Muslim these Muslim states and Muslim political culture as it really from like 1300 until 1700s, right?
Right.
And one thing I was really fascinating was this notion of the Rajputization,
Right.
which you describe, I think, really well, and that it goes back so early. And one thing which is really interesting to me is the idea that Rajput, if you go back to like 1300, Rajput isn't a ethnicity or a group of people who live in Rajasthan, right? It's almost made me think of samurai, this idea of sort of a martial retainer who could be anywhere, right? This sort of martial ethos and a notion of being a warrior for a certain lord. And then as you get into the 1500s, that really kind of focuses in on a certain group of families and clans that living in a certain area in these forts of Rajasthan, right? And then that becomes fixed there. But one of the things that was fascinating is that you have these figures, even in the sort of time of the Delhi Sultanate, who are Muslims who have completely absorbed this Rajput martial ethos to the point that they do the Jauhar thing, where they, whether it's in one guy you talk about, I think is in Rajasthan and Ranthambore, and the other guy is in Bengal, right? And they're getting attacked, and so they put their whole families to death, and then they go out and like these suicide missions, basically. And they're Muslims, which I thought was so interesting. Maybe you could just go into more of like this and how much the Rajput ethos ends up shaping the Mughal political culture.
Well, that's a very good point, and it is a very fascinating one because it shows you the degree to which by the 16th and 17th century, I mean, Muslims now have already been in South Asia for half a millennium, and by this time, they are assimilating at an extraordinary rate into dominant modes of culture. And since the Rajputs were kind of the martial class of North India into which the Turks were insinuating themselves, it was perhaps inevitable that there would be a lot of cross-fertilization between the two. And yes, you're right, the tradition of Johar, the destruction of women, when you know that you're doomed, this was happening. We begin to see Muslims doing this in Bengal on several occasions. Another example of that, of course, is the Jataka Darshan. The Jataka Darshan is this tradition of having a special balcony, which is built on the exterior of the facade of a palace, where the ruler would present himself for darshan, for viewing by the subjects. Well, this was an ancient tradition among North Indian kings. Rajputs were not the only ones who did this, but it was a style that was picked up probably as early as Humayun. Everyone says it begins with Akbar, but I think the idea really is, it really goes back to his father, Humayun, who begins to this tradition of greeting the sun while the subjects are greeting you. And there's this, and which is of course a purely North Indian style of kingship. And so the Rajput tradition certainly lives on, and perhaps most importantly, Akbar's assimilation of Rajput women into his harem meant that the particular dialect of northeastern Rajasthan, Braj, now enters the Mughal harem, and the next generation of Mughal rulers are the sons of Rajput women, meaning that they have learned Hindavi language as their mother language, literally their mother language. And we all know that mothers have more influence on children than fathers ever do. That's probably anywhere in the world. So if we look at language, if we look at styles of political presentation, the Jataka I just mentioned, if we look at the Johar tradition, all these are Rajput ideas and cultural norms which become readily assimilated by the Mughals. So it's really almost fair to say that the Mughals are, in many sense, really a Rajput dynasty. By the time you get to Shah Jahan, the Mughals have more Rajput blood, just in terms of how many Rajput women had been there. The Turkish or Central Asian proportion of their ethnicity, physically speaking, gets progressively diminished as you move from the early 16th century, from Babur himself, down to the time of Shah Jahan.
Yeah, you mentioned how Shah Jahan was 3/4 Rajput.
That's right.
Right. So one question I've always had, and it's been hard to find an answer. So when let's put it this way. So when Babur comes into India, what language would he be yelling at his kids in? And
Turkic.
then, okay, so Turkic. Okay, then at what point do you think they start yelling at their kids in North Indian language, Hindavi, with Akbar?
Definitely with Akbar, because by the time you come to Akbar, again, it's because of the rapprochement between the Mughals and the Rajputs that these Indian women come into the harem, and their sons have every much legitimacy as do the sons of Central Asian women. And so it means that really from his period on is when you see this trend coming in. Linguistically, there's no doubt that Turkish was as you put it, the language you speak to your children, or the dinner table, at home. Certainly going all the way back to the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids, the Mamluks, the Khiljis, and the Tugluks. They were all Turkish speaking as their first language. The Lodis would have been Afghan. They were speaking Pashto. But then when you're with Babur, you're back with Turkish, probably Humayun as well. But beginning with Akbar, you are seeing, like the Baburnama gets translated from Turkish into Persian. And with Akbar, it's really Hindavi, not Turkish, that is the spoken language at home. Of course, Persian is patronized by all of them, all of these dynasties. But yeah, Hindavi comes into the court as as a dominant language, as an important language, beginning with Akbar, and then really reaches its height under Aurangzeb.
So one thing which, I mean, this notion of Hindavi, right? You know, one often hears that sort of Hinduism as a religion is sort of a creation, a category created by British, you know, colonial scholars. I'm not a specialist in this, so I just read this numerous times. But what I thought was interesting was that you talk about how Shivaji, this kind of founding Marathi leader in the 1600s, he fashions himself as a protector of the Hindu faith, which I'm going to butcher, Hendavi Dharma Dharakla.
Right.
So what was he, when he says, I'm a protector of the Hindu faith, what is he actually, I mean, is he saying there's a thing called Hinduism, I'm the protector of this thing, or what is he referring to? Would everybody have understood what he meant?
That's a fascinating question. Needless to say, Shivaji is one of these lightning rods in Indian history because of the widespread belief that his whole mission was one of protecting, preserving, if not restoring, the whole idea of Hindu kingship. And it is true that he self-consciously was doing precisely that. He famously brings in a Brahmin all the way from Benares down to Maharashtra in order to officiate at his own coronation. Why? Because he needs to be publicly seen not as a coming from a somewhat middling or lower caste in the Maratha society, but rather as a kshatriya, as a warrior. And it was his desire to present himself as a kshatriya and have this Brahmin coming all the way from Benares down to officiate. That is what I think led him to go the whole distance and see himself as therefore preserving not only an upper caste kshatriya persona, but also a specifically Hindu one. And I think that's really what he was all about. He needed to justify his seizure of power, which is not unusual. This happens all the time in Indian history. People need to find some means of justifying their grabbing power. And Shivaji was an extraordinarily successful warlord who was able to parlay his victories into one of kingship, which was then retroactively justified through this idea of his being a kshatriya, and also through the idea of his now being one who's defending Hindu dharma or the Hindu religion.
I'll just ask one more question. I think probably then hand it over to other people who have questions, if that's okay with you, Mizan. One thing that you bring up several times in the book, which it comes up a lot, of the flow of money. And I thought this was, you talk about the transition, there's sort of a transition from the sort of Ghaznavids and the early Ghurids as like these raiders are basically coming in and raiding and then going back into Central Asia. Really, they're to once you get to the Ghurid and the founding of the Delhi Sultanate, that now precious metals and treasures are no longer being kind of taken out of India. They're staying there. But then there's you get further expansion or raiding into the south, into the Deccan, which is not done out of some kind of bloodlust or something, but because the main concern of the Khaljis and Shah Balan and people like that is actually defending against these constant Mongol attempts to invade, right? So they're basically raiding to the south to get money to pay for more horses and more troops to defend against the Mongols that are coming from the north. Right. And then you talk about the wealth of textiles, whether it's the Deccan, whether it's Bengal, and that it's this textile trade that really starts to integrate, that really integrates India into a world economic, kind of Indian economic zone. And then as you get into the 1600s, 1700s, into a global economic trade with Europe. So I mean, I guess maybe is if you were to talk about this as a book about textile, what would you say?
Well, I think you're right. Textiles are really I think lie at the base of understanding India's relations, economic relations with the rest of the world. I mean, India had been exporting textiles for long before the Turks reached North India. I mean, we know that there is a long historical kind of trajectory of India's need for silver, because India does not have much in the way of its own silver mines or gold mines. So in order to obtain silver and gold, it has always been historically necessary for India to export the one thing they do have, which is lots of cotton and silk, especially cotton textiles. So here's, as you rightly point out, Gujarat, but also Coromandel and Bengal become major centers of textile production throughout the whole period of my book. But doesn't start with my book. That had already been a well-established pattern that long preceded the arrival of the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids. And of course, it's the 18th century that we normally think of as the moment when India suddenly breaks open in the world scene. Obviously, because that's why the British East India Company went there, was to find the origin of these very finely woven muslin cotton goods, which were especially prevalent in Bengal, which is why Calcutta became the center of the company's operations. But that is really reading history backwards. The reality is that, we have material evidence of Gujarati cotton goods being exported to Egypt as early as the 8th and 9th century, because the fabric itself has survived in the dry climate of Egypt. So if you go to the Textile Museum in Ahmedabad, for example, in Gujarat, you'll see these kinds of things, or even the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., as I remember it, has a few remnants of that same fabric. So we have the physical evidence of India's export of textiles going very far back in time. This was the engine that drove India's long-term connection with the rest of the world, because they needed horses and they needed silver. And these items were bartered largely through the export of textiles, but obviously spices and many other things as well. But yes, I would agree with that. Textiles are really lie at the base of the whole story. And you look at how many words in English language today come from textiles, like calico, sash, cummerbund, seersucker, shiro shakar in Persian, milk and sugar. They're all over the place. And that draws attention not only to India's extraordinary integration with the rest of the world in terms of its exporting of textiles, but it also points to the influence of Persian on India, once again, which I always go back to that, which is after all the title of the book, India and the Persianate Age, because many of these words for textiles were themselves ultimately Persian words, like khaki, like seersucker,
Bandana,
tafta, and so many others. So and I just want to kind of say one last thing, Jack, and that is that the reason that I really wrote this book was because I was dissatisfied with the traditional way in which this long period of India's history has been presented, which is to say, as one long story of Hindu-Muslim interaction, if not conflict. I came to see that as, to a great extent, a matter of reading history backwards, starting with the partition of 1947, and then reading all of previous history in terms of culminating in that, as if all history was simply a prologue to the partition. And I also have to say that I saw so much evidence that contradicted the idea of perpetual Hindu-Muslim conflict, without denying that there was, of course, Hindu-Muslim alterity and identity. Obviously, there was lots of that. But I needed to find some alternative model or a way in which to grasp this 1,000-year period of history. And to go back very briefly to my own biography and how this happened. You know, Penguin commissioned me they wanted me to write this book as a textbook. And so when I almost finished the book, I was at a dinner party here in Tucson, and a colleague of mine, actually the wife of a colleague of mine, who knew nothing about Indian history, asked me a very innocent question after dinner. She said, "Dick, what is the argument of your book?" And I kind of stared out the window for a minute. I didn't have any answer because I didn't imagine that my book had an argument. I didn't think that textbooks were supposed to have arguments in the way that monographs always do. But I slept on it, and by the next morning, I woke up with the idea that yes, there is an argument, and I need to make that argument. And the argument is that the traditional kind of way, the threadbare way of looking at Indian history through the prism of religion is to some extent a red herring, to some extent a rabbit hole that we've all gone down, perhaps too far. And I thought there needed to be an answer to this. I've been dismayed at the way in which, especially in the age of Modi, there's been this polarization of medieval Indian history, which he himself, I have to say, dismisses as 1,200 years of slavery. Now that's his rhetoric. And when I hear words like that, I'm thinking this whole thing needs to be rethought. And when I discovered Shelley Pollack's book on Sanskrit and his thesis of the Sanskrit Cosmopolis, a light bulb went off in me, and I suddenly realized that this could be the answer. This could be the argument that the hostess at this dinner party was asking for. Namely, that there actually was a Persian cosmopolis, although I don't use that word in the book. I think it's too jargon. You need to use a more user-friendly word. But if anything, the Persian cosmopolis was more cosmopolitan than Shelley Pollack's understanding of a Sanskrit cosmopolis. And so I went with that. And that's kind of the way, that's the backstory of how the reason I wrote the book.
I think one of the, to your point, one of the sort of ironies that comes out, and you say this very clearly in the book, which is that, Persian was a really good cosmopolitan language and idiom because it actually wasn't attached to a religion, right? So you have Arabic is attached to Islam, Sanskrit is attached to sort of Hindu Brahmin tradition, but Persian was this language that sort of everybody could use administratively or historically or in poetry or referring to Sa'di's Gulistan or something, because it was a shared pool, kind of a value-free pool of language and ideas and references. So it's sort of ironic that so I guess starting with the British, as you describe it, this kind of the Indian Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, the Muslim Ages, right? The British sort of all lump that in together, is kind of categorized as Mohammedan or Islamic when one really could think about it as like a time when you have the most ecumenical idiom of communication.
Yes, that's right.
I see there's a lot of people here. I know if they have questions or not. Mizan, how do you want me to do this? You just want people to pipe up or raise their hand, or how should this work? Or should they write things in the chat?
Jack, just continue. We still got about half an hour, so we've got about another 10 more minutes we can take between yourself and the professor, and then we'll open up for questions from the.
Because I've seen some names in this. I see some names on there I recognize. These are not stupid people. They have to have questions.
It's your shout, Jack. It's absolutely.
No, I mean I know some of them maybe people who might complain about not being called on or something. There's a chance
Fair
to have
enough.
your voice heard, folks. There's a chance to have your voice heard. You've got Richard Eaton here. He's on the phone. He's sitting there.
Okay, so Bismillah. Okay, let's just start with the questions. Apologize for the background noise. I mean,
I can ask him questions for
yeah.
I can ask questions for as long as I feel like it. I have tons of questions, but you people, there's 66 of you. I know some of you out there.
Okay, so yeah, so Jack, there's some questions on the chat. So you choose which ones you want to get answered. It's up to you. And if there's anyone who wants to ask questions directly on the Zoom, please raise your hands on the Zoom icon, which is to raise your hand.
I don't see that. We're in the chat of the questions.
Bismillah.
I don't see any questions in the chat. Am I looking at the wrong place or something?
Yeah, you have to push the chat button.
Yeah, I have it, but okay. Well, anyway, if you see them, then you can answer them directly because I don't see any. I just see sort of things about you.
Okay, so let me
Mizan is
read out
written.
some of the questions. One question from Yahya Bert. Why is there an absence of scholarship, not only Razia Sultana's rule, but what is also meant for a woman to lead the Delhi Sultanate? Question from Hasibnul. What was the relationship of the Mughals with the greater Muslim world other than rivalries? What were their relationship with the Ottomans in this period? Do you expound on this in the book? How do you view themselves in the greater Muslim world? And a final one, Rizwan. I'll do three at a time, and we'll get three responses. Why isn't there a detailed history of Punjab written in recent times, considering the regions of importance in South Asia? The last significant general history is by S.M. Latif over a century ago from the colonial period. What point did the Mughals become Indian? Babur appears sparingly towards Indians in his autobiography. Hand it over to yourselves.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't really hear those questions. Jack, did you hear those? Can you repeat them for me? I'm not.
Okay, I'll read the first one again. First one from Yahya Bert, Leeds in the UK, about Razia Sultana. So his question was, why is there an absence of scholarship, not only Razia Sultana's rule, but also what is meant for a woman to lead the Delhi Sultanate? What is meant for a woman to lead the Delhi Sultanate? A question about relationships with the Mughals and the other parts of the Muslim world, besides rivalries. Do you expand that in the group? And why isn't there a detailed history of the Punjab since S.M. Latif's time? Yeah, there hasn't been really anything there.
Well, the only question I was able to hear there was something about Razia Sultana. And I'm not quite sure what the question was, but I can only say that she stands out, obviously, as a important figure in.
Yes, I think the question about Razia Sultana was, what did it mean for a woman to lead the Delhi Sultanate?
Well, it's hard to say. We do know that she had to dress as a man. So if nothing else, it means that a woman could not be presented as a woman in order to have credibility. But I do not think that that's the reason that she was ultimately brought down, despite the fact that she was the favorite child of her father, Iltutmish. The real problem was that all of the children of Iltutmish were doomed by the fact that they were not only weak inherently, but more importantly, the slave system was breaking down, and the loyalty of slaves, which had been a prominent feature in the 13th century, by the time you get the early 13th century, by the time you get to the period of Iltutmish in the mid 13th century, the loyalty of slaves is not as dependable as it had been earlier. So I think that Razia Sultana, was a victim of that as much as she was a victim of being a woman in a world of which women had not therefore ruled.
One other question, Professor Eaton, was about you know, why is the Punjab, hasn't there been any recent histories of the Punjab, considering the region's importance?
Well, there have been important works on the Punjab in recent times. There's a recent book, fairly recent book by Indu Banga. There's this book by several books by Purnima Dhawan that we spoke about earlier, writing about the Sikhs. Fenich is another study of the Sikhs of the Punjab that came out, his book on, I forget the title of that one. But I don't think I wouldn't say that there's been a deficit of research on the Punjab relative to other parts of South Asia, necessarily.
One thing I thought was interesting, you make this point in your book, which is that the places where you have the largest concentrated conversion to Islam are the Punjab and Bengal,
right?
Both of which had never been integrated into the kind of Hindu caste universe, right? Which I thought that was a really interesting point.
That's correct. That's an important point. And that's one of the things that kind of drove me to the study of Bengal and Punjab both. I spent a year in Lahore, and I spent a year and a half in Dhaka on both occasions, trying to understand how do we explain this phenomenon. And certainly one thing that these two regions did share in common was that neither one of them had been tightly integrated into the Hindu caste system, especially Western Punjab. I'm speaking of the Jats, and because they would ultimately form the largest element of Punjabi Muslim society. The same is true in Bengal, where you have lots of communities living in, especially the eastern part, known as Patti, where that had not yet been integrated into the Hindu caste system to the degree that you find in North India, which happened to be the capital of these Muslim states. So there's a curious contradiction between the center of Muslim power, which is North India, and the regions where Islam as a faith became most vibrant from a demographic standpoint. And to explain that, I think one has to go deep into Indian history to understand the way in which Aryavarta, this homeland of Brahmins, was always geographically understood as occupying the Delhi Doab, the area between the Jumna and the Ganga. And then as you move east or west from that area, you are, the whole Hindu order is in a sense becoming diluted to the point where you go into East Bengal, Brahmins would actually have to go through various elaborate ceremonies in order to become purified for becoming polluted by even visiting those regions. So that is part of the story. And that's, again, you're right. I think that's one of the things that are shared in common between Western Punjab and Eastern Bengal.
I just want to remind the listeners that Professor Eaton's been very generous, and he's always saying, I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. But all I'm doing is just reading things in his book. So in fact, he's right. I'm not claiming any insights here, right? A couple of questions. How do we understand pre-modern and early modern empires like the Mughals in comparison to empires and imperialism today or in the kind of colonial period? There's a push to, in some circles, to see the Ottomans and the Mughals as similar to European colonizers. How would you respond to this?
Right. Pre-modern empires are unlike anything today, I think, mainly because, well, many respects. In the first place, and we talked about this earlier, the fact that the empires are really multinational, multicultural, multi-religious systems where the emperor needs to be seen as authentic and legitimate in the eyes of all these various diverse communities. This is true not just in India, but it's also true of the Ming Dynasty or the Qing Dynasty in China, where the emperor had to present himself in part as a Central Asian shaman, in part as a Buddhist bodhisattva, in part as a traditional Confucian emperor. And the same thing is true, especially from Akbar's period forward, where you have this doctrine of sacred kingship, which blended together all sorts of different ideas. I spoke earlier of the Ajanta Dharshan, which was an indigenously Indian institution. These kinds of things are, I think, characteristic of pre-modern empires, especially in India and China. Not so much the Ottoman. If you wanted to become an Ottoman noble, you had to be Muslim. A Christian had to be converted to Islam before he could enter the system, not just as a janissary, but at any level in the Ottoman system. And that, to me, is a striking difference between India, the Mughal Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, where the Ottoman was much more oriented around this whole idea of an Islamic state. After all, the Ottoman Sultan also was the Caliph. Those ideas never had any traction in India. A last point I would make, Jonathan, is in terms of difference between modern and pre-modern. In the modern era that we live in, you have this notion of the public sphere. Habermas's idea of the public space, right, where everyone is trying to occupy that space, whether it's through, and of course it's created by the media. So everyone is connected by not just newspapers and radio and television, but also obviously the internet and all this technology, so that there's a huge competition for controlling the public sphere. That did not exist in the pre-modern world. And the lack of a public sphere in the 17th or 18th century or even earlier meant that different people could hold radically different ideologies or traditions and not be bothered, because there was not any competition for who's controlling the media, who's controlling the public sphere. And that, I think, is a very important difference between the modern and the pre-modern anywhere in the world.
That's very interesting. I'm actually haven't heard that
Jack,
brought up before.
we have a question directly from a person who put their hand up, Rizwan. Can I just get him through? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Rizwan. Yep, just hold on. Rizwan, do you want to, I'm going to unmute you now. Please ask your question directly.
Yes. Yeah. The question about the general history of the Punjab, the book recommendations you made, I'm aware of those books. I was asking a general history of the Punjab, but those books you recommended are limited in terms of either to a certain specific period, a limited period of time in history, or on Sikh, the Sikh people. So as far as I know, the last general significant history, general history, was in the colonial period by S.M. Latif over a century ago. So I was asking whether you knew, well, I was actually asking why there isn't by Western Orientalists, where has work been done on that, and considering the importance of this area in South Asia.
Yes, I think I agree with you. The books that I did cite and that I'm aware of are monographs, and monographs, almost by definition, take a narrow topic or a narrow theme or a narrow question and pursue that down to based on original sources. Whereas a general study of something like a whole region like the Punjab, those kinds of studies, I could almost say, have kind of gone out of fashion in a sense. Regional studies are not, you're right, they are more characteristic of the colonial period, where the British conceived of India as a collection of regions. And I think what defines modern historiography is a turning away from general regional studies and a preference for detailed monographs over particular questions. And so I think it's what you said about the Punjab is probably true if I think about it. It's not just the Punjab. I think it's almost anywhere in South Asia. You don't find the kinds of regional studies that try to tell you all there is to know about, say, Gujarat, or Orissa, or Tamil Nadu, or whatever it might be. If you want to get a degree in history today, you do not write a provincial history. What you do is you write a monograph on a particular theme within a province. So I think the answer to your question is it's not so much that the Punjab has been ignored, it's that the whole tradition of provincial histories or regional histories has kind of been sidetracked through the preferences and fashions of contemporary historiography.
There's a couple of questions about why do you think Babur preferred Chagatai Turkic over Persian when he was writing his memoirs? And another question is about the kind of general issue of just the female influence on Mughal rule as a broad question, but are there any, you talk about a few important women like Noor Jahan in your work.
Right. Well, let me go to Babur first and the Chagatai thing. That's his native language. We know from the Baburnama and other things that were written by Babur, he was a poet and he prided himself in Persian poetry as well as Chagatai. But to answer the question, why did he write his Baburnama, his famous, autobiography? Why did he choose Turkish? I think the major reason for writing that book was he wanted to write it for his son, Humayun, as a kind of a roadmap for how to rule this new kingdom that I'm going to bequeath to you. And that's my personal view. Obviously, Chagatai did not have the prestige or the transregional cachet as Persian did, but he was not writing it for the Persian world. He was writing it for his immediate family. And I think that's the reason that he chose Chagatai. But as I said, at the same time, he was a great connoisseur of Persian poetry and a judge, I might say. He was very harsh on people who would use the wrong poem at the wrong time, in Persian. So there is that. This question of the role of women in Mughal society is a fascinating one, and I'm always frustrated by this kind of question because, unfortunately, all we really know about, to a great extent, are the elite women. I'm thinking of books by Ruby Lal down at Emory University, in Atlanta, who has done work on Noor Jahan, has done work on the Mughal. The harem and the women, and also the work by Lisa Balalandar at Rice University in Texas, who's also studied the role of women in the earlier period. That is to say, with Babur and Humayun, not so much the period of Akbar and Jahangir. So. Yeah, I could say this, that Noor Jahan, speaking about her alone, she has undergone a huge transformation. Decades ago, she was simply seen as a kind of a Bollywood star, in a sense. And it was not taken all that seriously in her own right. And recent studies of her have really put her on the map as being a very important player in actually running the empire, especially as Jahangir himself kind of drank himself into the corner in the latter years of his reign. and the other thing I would say is that when we speak of the authority of women in the Mughal system, here is where especially the Rajputs had an extraordinary influence, because it was Rajput women who became increasingly dominant in the harem. As I remarked earlier, they were the ones who bequeathed the preference for Hindavi as the language, the dialect of Braj, spoken in Upper India. That became a court language through the agency of women in the court. So we see kind of in indirect ways how this influence became felt. In a larger sense, I would suggest that the Indianization of Mughal culture was largely a product of the presence of women. Even though they may have been in the background, they were the ones who raised the children, and they were the ones who passed on this culture to the next generation.
We've got some questions, Jack, direct ones. Yahya Burt, who wants to ask directly, I'm going to unmute him, and then Fahad Ishtiaq. We've got loads of questions, but we'll prioritize on the ones putting their hands up. Yahya, I'm going to unmute you and ask, please, directly. Yeah.
Oh, hello, sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Professor Eaton, thank you very much for the book, by the way, but how do you see your work fitting in with the thesis by the late Shihab Ahmed of the Balkans to Bengal complex? Do you see the Persianate Cosmopolis as it truly extending to that extent, centered perhaps on India and Persia?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, Shihab Ahmed's book, you're referring to What is Islam, right?
Yeah.
I found that to be a very frustrating book because I never found an answer to the question that's posed in the title. But I found it even more frustrating in the sense that I think he does talk about this Bengal to Balkans complex, but he fails to see, I think, Persianate culture as detached from the Islamic tradition, or as detached as I think it really was. And that's really one of the things that influenced me when I was writing my book. I read his book, and I thought there needed to be a response to that. And so in a sense, I wanted to think about this idea of Balkans to Bengal, but make it much more present, give it a greater prominence in the larger story, and to see it as, in a sense, displacing religion altogether, whereas Shihab Ahmed does not do that. Whatever he means by Islam, and I remain uncertain as to what he really answers that question, it does not seem to give, in my view anyway, a very prominent place for the Persianate tradition. And that's what I tried to do. My book was, in a sense, an attempt to supply that, to fill that gap.
Okay, is that okay, Yahya?
That's great, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we've got another question now from Fahad Ishtiaq. I'm just going to unmute you. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, Mr. Richard. I just have a question.
Yes.
Yes, you can hear me, right? Properly?
Yes.
Yes, great. How much of the Persianization or Persification of the South Indian, subcontinent can we put down to the rise of the Safavid Empire in Iran? Still a lot of scholars leaving the land, maybe escaping persecution, finding new opportunities. How much can we put it down to the rise of the Safavid Empire? Did it accelerate due to that, or due to the exchange of people, exchange of ideas happening on a more frequent basis? Is there a thought that you have on that?
Yes, thank you for the question. You are absolutely right. There was there was I wouldn't say an exodus, a mass exodus, but there certainly was a lot of movement of Iranian poets and Sufis and various kinds of literati from Safavid Iran to the Mughal Empire after the rise of Shah Ismail and the imposition of Shiism in Iran. And we can see that happening in North India. I did not talk about that in my own book, perhaps as I should have, given the title of the book. And I think if I were to do another edition, I would probably talk more about those migrants. But they were certainly there. On the other hand, I don't think they were all that significant because the overall arc of Persianization in India had already been underway long before 1500, long before Shah Ismail rises to power in Tabriz. You know, the Mongol invasion itself had driven all these Central Asians out of these Turks, these Persianized Turks, out of Central Asia into India, beginning in the early 1200s. Right. And we see all this evidence of Persian culture infiltrating India long before Ismail comes on. So what I would say is that what the Safavid revolution meant was that there was a further bump, there was a further influx of Iranians, which certainly had important impact in North India anyway, not the Deccan, but in North India. Well, the Deccan too, I guess, when I think about it. There was certainly more Iranians coming there as well. But they were only building on a tradition which was already very well established.
I mean, I think one point to keep in mind is, you know, if you read things like the Nuzhat and another of Abul Hayy al-Hassani, kind of biographical dictionary of India throughout the ages, but you see a huge number. There's lots that come from Iran and Central Asia. There's a huge number of scholars, ulama, coming from Hadramut into Gujarat, right, and even going and, you know, so one of the things that Professor Eaton brings up, I think really brings up in his book several times, is you get these sort of like almost gangs, like on one side of the royal court is the Easterners, namely the kind of indigenous Muslims from India. And then there's the Westerners, who are this sort of gaggle of Afghans and Iranians and Turks. And, you know, it depends on sort of what language they really feel comfortable speaking. So I think that was something that you see, and this appears, I think, if I recall correctly from your book, even in the 1300s and 1400s.
That's right. That's right.
In places like the Dawlatabad and
in Dawlatabad, that's right. And it became a poisonous feud between these two factions of Muslims. Those who were, as you say, born in the Deccan, descended ultimately from migrants from North India in the mid early 1300s, and those who were imported by sea from Iran, from Arabia, especially under Firuz Bahmani in the early 15th century. You get whole shiploads of nobles who he's inviting to come to the Deccan, and who receive all kinds of patronage and appointments to you know, in the nobility in the south. And a lot of these same people end up in Vijayanagara, which is a very important point, because we are, you know, previous historiography made us believe that there was some kind of a marginal line between a Hindu south and a Muslim north. Whereas in fact, many of these immigrants, these Westerners, Muslims immigrating from Iran, Central Asia, Arabia, ended up in the armed forces of Vijayanagara. And that's a very important dynamic. So yes, that cleavage between the native-born Deccanese and the foreign arrivals really tore the kingdom apart. The Bahmani state fell apart because of that. And that same cleavage was then inherited by all of the successor states of the Bahmanis from roughly 1500 forward.
Okay, sorry, I'm choosing questions because I think Mizan's battery died or something. Let's see. There's a couple of questions about Hagia Sophia issue. I don't know if you want to get into that. Aya Sophia, and how can you solve modern Indian sectarianism? Do you have any? I mean, you mentioned how your book is attempting to deal with that, but I don't think we expect you to resolve this.
No, I'm not going to solve the Hagia Sophia issue this morning.
One thing, a question about the relationship of the Mughals and the Ottomans. I mean, I know there was some exchange between them over the centuries, but one thing I thought was really interesting in your book is you talk about how basically after Akbar, the Mughal princes, you have a unification. You go away from what John Woods would call the appanage state model, where the kind of collective sovereignty of the Turco-Mongol Persian system, where kind of everybody in the family has a potential share. And no, now the succession is just going to go to one prince,
Right.
But you know, the father sends these princes out as governors. They campaign, they build up their networks, they build up their little armies. And then the second the father dies, it's, you know, ya takht, ya takhta, as you say, either coffin or the grave. So you mentioned how in precisely the time in the Ottoman Empire in the 1600s, where you have this sort of notion of the sultanate of women, or the harem sultan, where the Ottoman sovereigns themselves are basically just shut up and not allowed to do anything.
That's right.
The Mughals developed this system that is sort of like a, you know, social Darwinian weaning, that has these kind of brutal wars of succession, but then whoever wins is usually very, very competent. And so that I thought was interesting, is a kind of to think about a comparison between these two states.
Yes. Yeah, this is actually, let me just say one thing here about the book in general, of what it, in terms of its source material. Nothing in my book is new knowledge. This is not a monograph. Basically, when you write a book like this, you are plundering from whatever existing knowledge has come up. And on this point that you're raising here about the nature of wars of succession and what they were really all about, this idea I got almost entirely from Munis Farooqi's book, his study of the princes of the Mughal Empire, where he goes into, elaborates in great detail this very transition that you speak of, namely this earlier idea of collective sovereignty, which had been part of the Mongol, Turkic, Central Asian tradition, and that kind of bleeding into a winner-take-all understanding of the empire, which does indeed have a certain Darwinian flavor to it, in as much as it guarantees that although the wars might be bloody, they might be disruptive in the short term, in the long term, you're going to end up with the more connected, the best networked prince of them all. And that certainly is true with the big one, of course, the War of Succession of 1657-58, when Aurangzeb comes to power as the Emperor Alamgir. Now that takes me to, you know, my decision to make a whole separate chapter of focusing on just that one man. Aurangzeb is arguably one of the most controversial figures in all of Indian history, in my view. Many historians of the Mughal Empire don't even want to talk about him because it's such a toxic kind of lightning rod, radioactive would be another word, a third rail perhaps, mixing metaphors wildly here. But my point is that I felt I needed to talk about Aurangzeb and devote a whole chapter to him, because that's almost 50 years of Indian history where India was completely transformed, at least in many respects it was transformed, with this one individual kind of towering over the whole thing. So, and I also did that because I wanted to use biography. I'm fascinated by biography as a rhetorical technique. I wrote a book on the Deccan called The Social History of the Deccan 8 Indian lives, where each chapter was structured around one figure. And I kind of borrowed that same idea when I came back to this book. Obviously, when you're talking about 1,000 years, and you're talking about all of India, it's impossible to have a collection of biographies. But I did do that just for one chapter, because I felt that the reign of Aurangzeb, Alamgir, was so important and so misunderstood, and so many themes are come to the fore that I had to do that, including this theme of succession. The idea of, because during his reign, that you see the full transition from this earlier notion of collective sovereignty to the winner-take-all, one sovereign gets the whole prize, and that's why I wrote that chapter the way I did. I wanted to kind of feature those kinds of ideas as being matured and coming to their own light in the reign of Alamgir.
There's one question left we have time for, but before I ask, I just want to say that what I think is interesting about that is you also show how, in a way, Aurangzeb kind of brings that system down, because he's so, not only do you have the threat, there's always the threat of one of the princes sort of coming back too early and kicking his dad out, or, his dad's not quite dead, right? Like with Shah Jahan. So you talk about, why did Aurangzeb sort of obsessively campaign in the Deccan? He never leaves his army, as that he never wanted any of his sons to get control of the army like he had. And so none of them ever really can be the next Aurangzeb, because he's such a towering figure that he doesn't really allow them to.
Precisely. Yeah, he did not allow them to have the freedom of movement, the maneuverability that he himself had been given, because he was very self-conscious of what might happen to him should they have that kind of freedom. I came upon this idea when I happened to find a direct quote from an Italian traveler. I think his name is Giovanni Carreri, who happened to interview Alamgir while he was in the Deccan. I end chapter 7 with this. He asked straightforward. I mean, for an historian, this is almost too good to be true. And it's amazing that no historians have picked up on this quote. Carreri asked Aurangzeb around 1678 or something like that, early 80s, why have you been marching up and down the Deccan all this time, constantly at war, while the capital is up in Delhi? You're down here, waging war in this apparently fruitless war against these Marathas. And Aurangzeb gave a very straightforward answer. He said, look, if my father had been more attentive and more watchful of his sons, he would not have suffered the fate he did, which of course is the fate that Aurangzeb himself gave him. And so that theme to me was that was one of the ways in which I wanted to answer the question of how we solve the riddle of why did Aurangzeb spend the last 25 years of his life marching up and down the Deccan Plateau, subduing one fort after another, only to see the first fort come back like whack-a-mole. Nothing was kept down. That quote by Carreri, I think, captured the central dilemma of the empire, which is that Aurangzeb had taken this idea way too far of winner take all, to such an extent that one must not allow other potential princes the same kind of maneuverability that they might become the next emperor and overthrow the previous emperor. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Again, I really recommend this book, people. Last question from Zanira. Can you give a quick summary of the genealogy of Hindi/Urdu, or could you provide book recommendations on this?
Yes. The book recommendation. Well, let's see. I don't have her book here, But the book you want is by Francesca Orsini. This is one of the books. This is co-authored with Samira Sheikh, called After Timur Left. But Francesca Orsini at SOAS in London, she is the one who I think has done the most exciting work on tracing the genealogy of modern Hindi Urdu. And the big point that she makes that I think is so important is that in the pre-modern period, especially the 15th century that she specializes on, language was not politicized. There was no notion that Hindus wrote in Hindi and Muslims wrote in Urdu. Of course, those words didn't even exist in the 15th century. There was one word, Hindavi, which was used for any local language. It could be Marathi, it could be Bengali, it could be Gujarati, or it could be Braj, whatever. And her point is that languages were not identified with communal identity. And so I would recommend Orsini, Francesca Orsini, as the go-to person for thinking through the genealogy of modern day Hindi Urdu in the previous. There are many other books one could talk about. I think Walter Hakala has another book that's I think very interesting. His study is somewhere up here. I can't see it right now. But anyway, Orsini and Hakala are the two books that immediately come to mind in trying to think about the pre-modern genealogy of Hindi Urdu.
Okay. Sorry, I was writing that down myself as you were talking. I don't know if Mizan's here anymore because his battery died, so I might have to do the.
Did we lose him?
unless he interrupts me. Oh wait, I see some. Unless he interrupts me and tells me to be quiet, I'll do the MC duties of.
I'm back, Jack.
Session.
I'm back.
Okay,
I'm back.
you're back. So
He's back.
You can
He's
take
back.
over.
I'm so sorry. Continue. We've still got about 5 minutes if you want to continue. Like round up maybe perhaps.
Okay.
We're flexible. It's up to you. We've got loads of questions coming through. It's really up to the professor and yourself.
I mean, I'm always happy to talk, but I also don't want Professor Eaton to like pass out from exhaustion.
No. I'm delighted. I've got all the time. This is early morning. I have all day. So
let's see.
So continue, guys. We've got about
I'm just trying to find
maximum,
questions that are
15 to 20, 15 minutes maximum.
I'm trying to find some questions that are, you've touched on some of them, so I don't want to get any questions that you kind of sort of touched on already. One thing that was really interesting, I thought, was how, to get back to this issue of like kind of pre-modern states, and Marshall Hodgson talks about this. You may have mixed feelings about that, but this idea that the pre-modern conquest states are sort of driven by this logic where, in order to pay your troops with precious metals, you have to conquer more area and get more treasure,
right.
And then you can't really you stop conquering. You kind of reach some limit, and then you have to pay your troops. So you create this sort of iqta or jagir system, right, where you say, okay, well, you get all the revenue from this place. And then eventually the ruler ends up giving away kind of titles so much land that the nobles no longer need the ruler. The ruler sort of becomes just a titular figure. And is that sort of what starts to happen in the reign of Aurangzeb, or is this a more specific Indian context?
That's a great question, and I think it is. It's not confined to the period of Aurangzeb at all. We see this thing happening long before. I mean, Hodgson talks about the military patronage state, which is what I think you had in mind, right? In your own introduction there, the pre-modern state. But I think there's a deeper issue, and I talk about this at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, when I speak about the Cholas and the Chalukyas of South India. where you have a similar dynamic whereby the ruler, the Raja, the Maharaja, would give away so many symbols of power to his subordinates that the subordinates ultimately ended up de facto independent. And this was the paradox, it seems to me, of Indian kingship long before the Turks and Persians even arrived, which is to say that in order to prove that you were really a Maharaja and not simply a Raja, you had to bestow upon your subordinates the fly whisk, the kettle drum, or other symbols of authority. And pretty soon these symbols became more than symbolic. They would also represent things like the right to collect taxes, or even the right to raise armies. Well, when you are collecting taxes and raising armies, you are, for all intents and purposes, independent. And this is how large empires in ancient India and early medieval India, they would fall apart precisely over this mechanism. The Chalukyas of the Deccan, for example, gave way to the Hoysalas in the north, the Hoysalas in the south, the Yadavas in the north, the Kakatiyas in the east, precisely because they were, in a sense, driven by the need to give away these symbols of authority. And so this is not new with Marshall Hodgson, the military patronage state. There's a paradox that is found in rulership in India, which predates the coming of the Turks, but it's also practiced by the Turks. The Mughal Empire itself ended up having to partner with all kinds of local figures around the fringes of its own imperial edges. I mean, when you have local Sufis in the Punjab, or you have landowners in Gujarat, or you have zamindars in Bengal who are given de facto authority precisely because there's no one else out there. But these people already do have authority in their local communities, so you simply confer upon them a certain measure of sovereignty. So that the idea here is that bit by bit, Mughal sovereignty was chipped away and given to all these minor figures in the process of imperial expansion. And there's an irony in the sense that the empire ultimately found itself being hollowed out from the center by the very fact that it was necessary to bestow these de facto rights of governance on lesser figures. But my point is that this already had a deeper parallel in India long before the Turks even arrived. It goes all the way back to the Cholas and the Chalukyas.
One question about ulama and traditions of learning. One thing you mentioned in the book is I don't know if I didn't read enough about it, but you talk about Akbar's madrasa reforms.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I think you mentioned it sort of in passing. Is there more you can add or would like to add about that? Or is it something we should go and read on? Or
Okay, which reforms do you have in mind by Akbar? Because he made lots of reforms.
Yeah, I can't remember. It's I think it's toward the very end of the book. It's not. You mentioned it sort of in passing, and we're kind of referring back to Akbar and his.
Well, for example, the madrasa system was reformed by Akbar as a vehicle for the diffusion of Persian language, and Persian becomes the language of state from 1572 or whatever the exact year was. That all levels of the empire would be administered through this one language, Persian. And to do that, he needed to reform the madrasa system to be not a exclusively religious institution, but rather one that also imparted language.
You know, I just found something that thank you for answering that. But this I really want to know the answer to. this is the end of the book. You close with a set of observations, which I think are really fascinating. Which is you basically say that we really shouldn't think about modernity sort of starting with the British, but that a lot of the processes that lead to modernity in South Asia are really present going back into the 1500s. You talk about systematization, routinization. You talk about Aurangzeb and notion of rule of law.
Right.
And one of the things I thought was really interesting, especially, and it's really ironic in the light of when you look at Indian travelers in the late 1700s and 1800s, people like Munshi Timad and people like who traveled to England, or Mirza Abu Talib, and they talk about how, you know, the British are so punctual and the Europeans are so punctual as opposed to sort of the decadent, lazy sloth. They're decadent, lazy, sloth-like fellow Indians who are sitting around eating food and writing Persian poetry. But you bring up this point about how Akbar has this clock, this water clock in the Fatehpur Sikri Palace, and everything in the palace runs by the clock, which I thought was really interesting.
Right. Yeah, that was an observation made by a Jesuit who was there, and I picked up on that. I forget who that was, but it was one of the Jesuits in Akbar's court made this observation, kind of offhand observation, and I said, "Wow, that's an interesting point." The whole, it's like an office. The whole court runs by time, and we think of, you know, the invention of the mechanical clock in Europe as having this revolutionary character of that people who had been farmers who simply lived by the rising and the setting of the sun are now under the rule of this device, which tells them when they have to show up for work and when they leave work. And we always think of this as kind of something that's uniquely modern and uniquely European. And then I saw this offhand remark made by this Jesuit. I found that's very interesting because clearly Akbar was already anticipating a similar kind of idea with respect to the running of the court at Fatehpur Sikri. So yes, that is one dimension of what I think we can legitimately call modernity. And the rule of law, the idea that that law exists outside of religion, outside of society, and it dissolves the idea of sacred rulership. That idea was introduced by Alamgir. I thought was very important because it gave this kind of ironic twist that we are normally accustomed to thinking of Akbar and Aurangzeb as polarized between, you know, the good Akbar and the wicked Aurangzeb. This is the trope that we always hear. Whereas in fact, I came to the conclusion that they are both equally interesting because they are both equally modern, but they both also failed for different reasons, of course. But so I chose to end by thinking of Akbar and Aurangzeb, but not through the usual trope of good versus bad, you know, but rather tragic heroes or tragic modernists who had these ideas in their head, but they were not able to fully institutionalize it.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time and sharing your knowledge with us, discussing your book with us. Thank you all for coming. Mizan, thank you for organizing this. You do a lot of legwork.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan. Thank you, Professor Richard Eaton. Jonathan, do you want to final words from Professor Richard Eaton, and you can close off?
I would just say I really hope that I get to have some good desi food with both of you, and how many other people in the audience are going to be there at some point soon, and that we can all eventually start moving around. That's my.
Yeah, I want to repeat that. I'd like to second that motion, Mizan. I want to thank you for making this possible, and I also want to say how much I look forward to coming back to London.
I hope so, Professor. I'm so sorry to everyone, and I'm so sorry for the noise around me. Number one. Number two, there's a lot of questions still coming through and people are really annoyed. I apologize. I'd really like to apologize. But anyway, I'd like to thank you once again, everyone, for attending. It's been one of our longest sessions, most fruitful sessions as well. Hope to see you in the next session as well. Thank you. Professor, we hope to see you after the whole lockdown. Thank you very much. And Dr. Jonathan as well. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
We'll do that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jack.